All right, recording now. So right now here, I literally just have a basic React app spun up right now. There really isn't anything going on right now. It's literally just a React app from scratch. What can anybody tell me anything about lifecycle methods? What are they? Why are they used and where are they used?
We have component did mount, should component update, component did update, and component will mount, I think. And I think what the component life cycles are, or what the lifecycle methods are, I'm sorry, is they're like re-inspecting the DOM every time something is changed.
So yep, you listed all the methods, which is correct. So I wouldn't say they inspect the DOM anytime the DOM changes. They inspect this. So anytime, so the lifecycle methods fire at different points within the component's lifecycle. And anytime data changes within the component or a parent component, it automatically triggers a re-rendering of those components. So those lifecycle methods can do things at different points in the component's lifecycle. So say, we're going to go through an example. Say I change some data and maybe I don't want the component to automatically re-render. Because again, remember, anytime data changes such as state or props, it automatically triggers a re-render of all the components down the component tree in relation to whatever data changed. So if there's like 5 different components, like this is the parent, child, grandchild, great-grandchild. If data changes here, it's going to automatically re-render this component and its child component. If data changes here, it's going to automatically re-render this component and all of its children. So maybe some data changes here, but I don't want this, whatever data is used here, maybe I don't want this component to actually re-render. So that's why I might use a lifecycle method saying, hey, should this component update? Yes or no? What other questions do you have, or do you have any specific questions you want me to go over before we jump into this little tutorial?
I do, Tom. So the lifecycle methods, they're set to fire based on certain triggers, and then they're set to fire at a certain time, and then they're going to trigger a re-render once they're fired.
They might trigger a re-render of the component based off of certain criteria that you set.
Okay.
So one things are true. The component didn't mount. If it exists in your component, it will automatically execute anytime the component initially mounts for the first time. Anytime the component unmounts, if you have the component unmount method inside of your component, that will trigger that component, or that method will automatically execute. If you have the should component update, that will execute, that function or that lifecycle method will automatically execute every time there is a re-render. Now, and then there's will update. We'll go over them. Will unmount. Component did update. So anytime the component does update, if you have that lifecycle method inside of your component, that will fire as well. And you can do some logic in there if you wanted to.
So we can put whatever we want inside these methods. We're basically just defining like at what point in this entire, and at what point like during the React, all these. So we have a lot of React processes happening. So what we're going to use these lifecycle methods for is to execute certain blocks of code when certain events happen, basically.
Yep, exactly. So let's go through. So I'm going to bring up. So here's my basic app.js. So again, the lifecycle components are explicit to class-based components. So they don't exist in functional-based components. But they're not being deprecated. You're going to be seeing them if you ever work in React on the front end. You'll still see lifecycle components. People still use lifecycle components because some companies, you know, they're like, we prefer, they're like, their lead developers prefer to use class-based components over functional-based components for whatever reason. So they're still going to be around. You will see them in whatever legacy code base you guys work in. So the first thing, I'm just going to change. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a counter, and just like we have in the past, and that counts up. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to create or convert this app.js to a class-based component. So I'm just going to say class app, and this extends the component class that comes built into React. So I need to import component from React, and then this class always needs a render component or render method. And then inside of there, we can put the return statement. Something's broken. Turn. Oh, I need to bring that up. There we go. So, okay, it's still working. Good. So just like a class, what's the first thing, if you think about Python, what's the first thing that executes in a class in Python when you invoke a class object?
Dunder init.
Dunder init. What's the equivalent in a class for JavaScript?
Constructor?
Yep. So you could say constructor here, and then we could say super. So super is accessing the parent component. You can do that. And then we can I'm just going to console log, and then here we can execute state. So just like in an init dunder, or just like in a Python dunder init, we can create a new state by using this .state. Now you don't need a constructor. I'm just going to kind of show you at what point things are executed. So I'm going to say counter is null, and then I'm going to say is mounted is false. Then below this, I'm going to say console log constructor. So if I refresh that, I come over here, notice how the constructor is automatically called first, right in here. And then what's the next thing that's called? That's just, I'm just going to console log render down here, like so, and it's going to refresh. Whoop. We have the constructor is initially called, and then the render method is called. So I'm just going to get rid of all of this crap and create a button that says toggle counter. And this toggle counter is going to mount a new component. So on click this toggle counter. So it's going to execute this toggle counter method. And then inside of my class, I'm going to say toggle counter. I'm going to make it an arrow function. And this whole thing is just to toggle this is mounted, change this to true. And if it's true, I want it to change it to false. So I can say return this dot set state. I don't even need to return it. I can just say this dot set state. Is mounted is the opposite of the current value of is mounted. Questions so far about what I'm doing? So this is literally just a button. When I click this button, it's going to execute this method, and it's going to just toggle false, true, false, true.
I have a question for you, Tom.
Yep.
So with your toggle counter function, you said we don't need to return anything. I kind of don't understand like when we need to return and when we don't need to return when defining these functions.
We could return it. It's not going to hurt it to return it. So I'm just going to return it just to keep things like we're used to when it comes to writing methods.
Okay.
Yep. So if I come over here, if I refresh this, I got the constructor, I've got the render, and now I'm literally just console logging counter or this dot state right here. So when I execute this, or when I click this, it executes the render method again, because again, it triggered a re-render, and the render method is called again, and now the is mounted is true. If I click it again, it triggers the render method, and now is mounted is false. What questions do you have so far about that logic? Let's talk about a little bit about conditional rendering. So we can say, hey, if is mounted is true, let's, this is a clicker component, and then I'm going to, in place of this, make it a component. So if I refresh the page, I need this dot state dot is mounted. So we got the constructor, the render, and I click that. It shows that this is a clicker component. It renders it, shows the state is mounted as true. Since is mounted as true, it's going to render, or it's going to show this H1. And now if I turn it off, it goes away. So toggle. What questions do you have so far about that logic? Don't be afraid to speak up or ask any questions.
Could you scroll up real quick, Tom? On
Yep.
app.js. Okay. So we are using is mounted, but and it's a lifecycle method, right?
No. So right now, this is just a variable.
Okay. Okay. I was just making sure. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So we just defined our own is mounted.
Yeah, I'm just literally saying, hey, is this mounted or not?
Okay.
I can call this anything.
Okay.
I can say like show components.
What's the specific difference between constructor and using just state?
So instead of
Yeah,
like instead of
sometimes
using
you're-
that, we just use state.
State.
There really isn't a whole lot. It's just if you want to, this is how I learned everything, but when I've seen like production code bases, they rarely ever use the constructor anymore. The reason why we do this is because we want to set state initially right when the component is mounted. It just like ensures that this dot state is there's values here before everything else is rendered.
But if you use just state, it isn't gonna be the same logic.
Pretty much, yeah. But this just like ensures that this state is created before anything else is rendered.
Okay.
Because the constructor function automatically is the first thing that's called.
Okay. And okay.
And like I can move this outside of here. And everything will still work the same, or it should. Yeah, I just kind of wanted to show you the constructor, like when that actually renders.
And
So-
one more thing about toggle counter. So we're using like an arrow function, right?
Yep,
We cannot use normal function.
you can, but so this is another reason why we use constructors. So if I use a regular function, I think it looks something like that. If I do that, refresh it, it's going to work, but when I click that, it's going to throw an error. It says cannot read property set state of undefined. And this is where we'd have to bind the content or the this of the app.js. So just like the self in Python class, we have to bind this to this toggle counter. And we can do that by doing .bind this. If we look up here, now it works. But just going forward, when in doubt, use arrow functions. So you don't have to use this stuff. You don't have to use
Okay.
.bind this.
Thanks.
And I'll keep the show component just so. Whoop. So I've got, instead of is mounted, I've got show component true or false. So let's just make sure everything still works. Great. So in here, let's create another component called clicker that's going to actually do some clicking. And yeah, so I'm going to say components as a clicker or counter.js. And this is going to be a state or yeah, class-based component. What is this one? RSF function.
Maybe RCC.
RCC.
Yeah.
Oh, yep, you got it. Sweet. Thank you. So in here, this is where we're going to be executing a bunch of different methods. Oh. So I'm going to move all this logic outside. So let's see. This dot state counter. Yeah, so I'm going to move all of this. Well, hold on. I guess I don't need this anymore. So this app.js component is only going to be this app.js component's only responsibility is to show this counter component. So I'm just going to do a constructor again. So I'm just going to get rid of this constructor in app.js because we don't need it anymore. I'm going to get rid of this console logs. And inside this constructor, I'm just going to console log constructor. And then also the render. And then inside of here, I'm going to just say class name equals app, just because I want everything to still be centered. I'm going to do an h1 tag and counter, and then I'm going to do this.state.counter. Up in here, I'm going to say state equals counter, and it's initially 0. Or we could say null, but let's just say 0. And then I'm going to create another button. That says update state. And this is literally just going to update the counter. So I'm going to say on click. I'm going to write a method called this update counter. So I need to write that method. So update counter. which returns this dot set state to counter equals this dot state dot counter plus 1. So let's just see if this even works. So this is a clicker component. Great, we have that working still. So now we have to export this counter into, in place of here, I'm just gonna display the counter. I'm not passing any props to it. So if I click here, there we have the toggle counter. All right. So when I click that, notice how the constructor runs in the counter and then the render method runs in the counter. Questions so far? So literally this app.js, this button is literally only responsible for rendering this counter. So when I click it, it renders it, does the constructor, goes into the render and displays that. Questions about that? Good? All right, so now we can focus on this. So the different lifecycle methods. What's the first lifecycle method that renders or that executes right when a component initially mounts? Anybody know?
The component did mount.
Component did mount, exactly. So I can say component did mount. And usually in component did mounts, this is where you'd want to do your API requests, just so you all know. So on a component did mount, this is where you usually want to dispatch to an API endpoint, get some data, and then update state. This is where you'd want to make API requests and update state with the response from the API. Does that make sense? It's usually where. So if I console log component did mount, if I refresh this, and now if I toggle the counter, we have the constructor running, then the render method running, and then the component did mount function running. Questions so far about component did mount? So now we're not actually doing anything with the counter yet, but when I want to, so you notice how every time I update the state, it automatically re-renders. So it's re-rendered 6 times, 7 times, etc. So we can actually call, well, before I do that, what's the opposite of component did mount?
Unmount?
Yep. So what component will unmount? I'm just going to console log component did unmount. I've actually never used component will unmount before, but this is where you might want to like clear some variables so they're not persistent somewhere in your application. So if I come over here and I refresh it, we have constructor, the render method, component did mount, and now if I toggle the counter to remove it, I get the component did unmount method is ran. So let's look at something. So we could say the other method is or lifecycle method is should component update. And should component update takes up to 3 different variables or arguments. Yeah, generally speaking, it receives the next properties, the next state, and like something else, but I actually don't know off the top of my head, but it's usually only these two. So we can console log next props and next state. And I'm just going to return false. So the component should component update is literally telling the component, hey, should I update? And the component should update lifecycle method should always return a Boolean value, true or false, indicating whether or not the component should update. So right now, I'm just going to say to false right now. And I just want to console log should component update. So I just kind of want to show you what that looks like. So I get the constructor, I get the render method, and then I get the component did mount. And now when I update state, it's going to execute the component or should the component mount, because anytime it re-renders, it automatically will execute this should component update method. So if I click that, it says should component update, and this is the props. There aren't any props being passed into this component, or there aren't any next props. And then the next state, notice how it says the counter is 1. But notice how it's also, see, notice how this is the next state that's being console logged right here. So state is being updated, but I'm returning false. So the component isn't re-rendering. So I'm just going to get rid of this next props because that's not really relevant right now. If I refresh it, click there. So that's the next state, next state, next state, and it keeps on executing the should component update. But again, I'm returning false, so I'm telling this component not to update. So it's not updating, and it's not updating the state because it's not triggering that re-render, or it's not triggering the render method again. What questions do you have about the should component update?
Yeah, so you can put logic in there and be like, if this state is like less than 5, update. And then,
yeah,
okay.
we can do exactly stuff like that. So exactly. So we could say, hey, if this dot state dot counter does not equal, or yeah, if it equals next state, we can return true, else return false. So we can say, hey, if the counter, the current state of the counter equals the next state, then we want to re-render it, else return false. Let's see if my logic is sound on that. So component did constructor, the render method executed, the component did mount executed. Oh, should component update ran, but it looks like this logic isn't correct. So I can say, oh, let's test it. We can say console log this dot state and next state, just to see if it works. So toggle the counter, component did mount. Oh, so the current state is 0, but the next state is going to be 1. So my logic should be, if it doesn't equal next state, counter next state dot counter. Does that make sense? So now if the current state's counter value does not equal the next state's counter value, then trigger a render. And it's going to come in here. It's going to trigger this render, and then it's going to update the state or this value here. If I refresh that, then click update, there we go. That's the current state. That's the next state, and then it re-rendered. I can keep doing that. Component should update. So the current state is 1. The next state is 2. It triggers the re-render and displays the current state, which is in this case the next state that it's going to be. Questions? What questions do you have about that? Is that sort of making sense?
Yeah, I think it makes sense. So basically, we would only use this lifecycle method when we want more control of when it renders, basically.
Exactly, because maybe your parent component is passing props and data down, and that doesn't affect this component. So you might not want to trigger a re-render. So that's, in that case, you'd come into here and just return false, depending on that condition.
So when all that comes down to, yeah, for these lifecycle methods, do they always return true or false?
No. Just the
should component update, I guess.
Yes.
Okay, so that always comes down to return true or false. And then if you return true, then the component should update. And then
Yep.
you just move on to the next piece of code.
Exactly. So I can even there. So should component update, still working. Yeah. And then I can even update. I can say, like, just for fun, I can say don't, or counter, let's say like name, or I don't know, some value. Goes true. And I can, again, do like a toggle and what am I doing? Toggle some value, return this dot set state. Some value is the opposite of this dot state dot some value. And in here, click. So that's all still working. But for example, say if I added toggle some value, and I can say like, hey, if this dot state dot some value does not equal next state dot some value, like return false. So even if I update the state, I don't want it to re-render. So it's still going into the should component update, but it's not updating the component. So it's still going in there, but it's returning false. But now if I click there, it's actually updating the component. Does that make sense? So I'm just going to get rid of this, just some value stuff. Toggle. And the very last one is, what's the very last lifecycle method that we haven't covered. We have should component update. What's the last one? Component did update. And the component did update takes in two values, previous props and previous state. I also think it takes in another value, but we don't really need to know that. So console log dot component did update. So if we refresh that, toggle the counter, renders the constructor, the render, and the component did mount. I'm going ahead and let's actually get rid of this. Let's refresh that. So constructor, render, component did mount. Should component update rendered, or should component update executed? The value is true, so the component update or the component rendered again. So it ran into this render method, and then it executed the component did update method as well. And in here we can say like, hey, this dot set state did update, set it to true. Say like, hey, did update initially is false. And then down here, we can do some conditional rendering saying this dot state did update and H1 component updated. So if I refresh that, I'm updating state. Why did it take so long? So should component update. Oh, that's weird. I wonder why. So it came into here, component did update. Oh, I know why. So if you notice, when I clicked here, should component update, updated, it executed the render method, updated the counter, and then it changed, went into the component did update, and then changed the this dot state to this to true. So yeah. And then it went down to here, should component update again. And the reason why should component update again executed is because did update updated. So it triggered a re-render, and then it came into here and it said, hey, did this counter or this dot state dot counter does not equal next state dot counter. This is false, so it returned false because we didn't actually update the counter when we updated the did update value. So in here, we can also say if did update or this dot state, I guess it would be next state, is true, return true. And we can even like, so up here, might as well even do an or statement here. So we can get rid of that. I believe this will work now. Toggle counter. Oh, shoot. Did it go into a, yep. So maximum call step exceeded. This can happen when a component repeatedly calls itself set state in the component or component did update. So it came into here, it's true anyway. So it looks like that didn't work. So again, I clicked counter, increased it by 1, ran the should component update, rendered the render method, displayed the correct number, ran into the component did update method, which is right here, and then I'm setting state did update to true, and then it rendered the should component update again, and it didn't update the component again because we didn't increase the value of this counter. So if I click this again, then that will show up. Questions about the component did update, should component update, component will unmount, and component did mount lifecycle methods, and when they trigger or when they fire.
I have a question about like kind of the number of states or like components that you have in here. In general, do they like kind of expand within like this file, or do you end up creating like a bunch more components and then updating like the lifecycle methods in those components? Like where's the line, I guess, between so like you're starting to build like an OR statement where you're kind of checking like two values. Like where's the line between like having an OR and trying to put in a little bit of logic versus splitting out like a new component and like dealing with it in there?
Yeah, it'd probably be better to split out the logic into additional components.
I just didn't know in general if there's like, oh, if you get to like 2 or 3 and it starts to get like harder to read, then you start splitting them out, or if people just kind of do it based on their preference.
Obviously, you should obviously try to keep your code as slim as possible. So I would split that stuff out into separate components. But it all depends on, you know, the problem at hand. And, but yeah. Anybody have any other questions? Is this starting to make sense, like the different lifecycle components as to when they trigger and everything? The main one you'll be using is the component did mount. This is where most of your stuff is going to be in there. And then I guess maybe the component did update.
Can we say like use effect, it's a combination of some of these methods?
Yeah, so the like use effect is the combination of component did mount, component did update, and I believe component should update or should component update.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, is there anything that hooks can't do that doing it a class, like doing it with this in class and lifecycle methods is required?
No, there's nothing. Yeah, no.
Can we do a use effect? I know when I was trying it, I got into an infinite loop and I got it working, but I feel like I just got lucky, to be honest.
We can try it in here. So I'm going to convert this to let's actually just copy this down and convert it into a functional based component. So I'm going to bring in use effect and use state. So in here, I'm just going to create this into a functional base component. Like so. I don't need a constructor anymore because this is no longer a class. I don't need this anymore. I don't need any of these. Don't need this render method anymore. I'm just gonna format this document. So again, this is just like a regular function in JavaScript. And I'm gonna go use state, const with a counter, set counter equals use state. And the initial value is, let's say 0. Instead of using this set state, I can get rid of that. I can set counter to, what is it? Counter +1. Let's see if this works. And then the use effect takes in a function, and let's just look at this console log component did mount. Let's see what happens. Oh, so we don't need that anymore. We don't need any reference to this. I'm just gonna get rid of that whole thing. Update counter is not defined.
Is it const update counter?
Oh, thank you. See, const, thank you. So let's bring this up here. I might get an error there. So let's see what happens when I do this use effect. Watch what happens. Oh, nothing. So it said component did mount. So everything's still working. And the reason why it's all, sometimes it's calling it all on the same line is because it's not done executing the function. That's weird. Anyway. Yeah, I don't know why it's, actually, I don't know why it's going on the other lines. But, see, there we go. So that's working. And if I do, takes in 2 arguments here. And then if I don't want anything to update, if I only want it to call once, let's see if this works. Toggle still works. So it's not calling the component did mount again, or it's not calling that use effect method again. So if you want it to act like a component did mount method, lifecycle method, just include an empty array in it. See if what this does. And if you want, in the use effect, if you want to keep track of what that variable in state, you want to trigger this use effect to execute again, you pass in that value in an array. And if you want to if you want to trigger this use effect that has that involve multiple different variables, you just do comma separated some value. So if you want to have this use effect trigger anytime the counter value changes, or this some other value, which would be like another some value. So there. So this is acting like component did update now. Does that make sense?
So is use effect only being called whenever like the set counter is being used, like whenever the second part of like that initial hook declaration is being called?
So the use effect is only being called anytime the counter value is changing. So right here. That answer your question?
Yeah, I think I didn't ask the right question. I'm trying to think of a better way to say it.
Oh.
I guess like how is it knowing like when to even consider using use effect? Like because if you have it blank, then it's just never looking at counter. But then like how is it going from, how does it know the counter has even been changed, if that makes sense?
So how does it know that counter has even been changed? So if I type in counter here.
Yeah, so like in that case, it's waiting for counter to change and then doing the use effect.
So it's always executing. It's like, hey, use effect is pretty much always executing, or not always executing, but yeah, it's essentially saying, hey, keep track of this counter. Anytime it changes, execute this first argument.
Okay, yeah, I think it's the part about it always running is the part that I am trying to ask about, and that answers it.
That's where you can get into like scary things with infinite loops, or I don't even know how I can do it. Yeah, I don't even know. Yeah, I can't even get this to run infinitely. But yeah, that's how it's done. Does this work? Oh, it still works. But generally speaking, you always want to have a value here, or have it be empty if you just want to act like a component did mount. What other questions you have?
Do you just want to have just one use effect, or is it okay to have multiple use effects?
You can actually have multiple use effects, I think. Don't quote me on that. I'll get back to you.
It's cool to do it. Like, it's not like bad, I guess.
I've never seen it done before. Actually, I don't even know if you can. I think you can. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I guess it is possible. It just depends on how complicated. If you only use one, it depends on how complicated your component is and how complicated you want the logic to be, or how complicated you want your logic to be in this single use effect.
And we can put some conditions inside the use effect, right?
Oh yeah. So like if counter is greater than 1, do something. Like set. I don't know. Yeah, definitely. It's just like a normal function. You can do all kinds of logic in there if you want.
I was just looking at the docs on React, and it looks like they use multiple use effects and then actually name the function that's inside use effect so that it can be called later.
Gotcha. Nice.